The courtroom was deathly silent. The judge's gavel came down hard, delivering the verdict that shattered Michael Carter's life. Guilty. A decorated officer with 15 years on the force. Michael sat handcuffed, staring at the floor. Despite his repeated claims of innocence, the jury had ruled against him. The evidence planted he was certain was enough to send him to prison, but the weight of the sentence wasn't what crushed him most. It was knowing he'd have to leave Luke, his loyal K9 partner, behind. Luke sat near the back of the courtroom, his sharp gaze locked on Michael. The German Shepherd had been more than a partner. He had been Michael's constant companion through life or death moments. Now, as Michael faced the lowest point of his life, the thought of never seeing Luke again was unbearable. When the judge rose to leave, Michael's voice broke through the tense silence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "but before I'm taken away, I have one last request. Please let me say goodbye to Luke." The courtroom murmured in surprise. The judge stopped studying Michael for a long moment. Finally, he nodded, his voice firm but sympathetic. 3 minutes, he said. As soon as Luke was released, the dog sprinted toward Michael, his claws clicking loudly on the floor. Michael dropped to his knees, pulling Luke into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, but buddy," Michael whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore," Luke whimpered, nuzzling into Michael's chest. But then something changed. Luke's body tensed and his nose began to work frantically against Michael's jacket. He tugged at the fabric, barking sharply. The sudden sound broke the solemn stillness of the courtroom, drawing every eye. "What's the dog doing?" the judge asked, frowning. Luke pulled harder, his sharp barks echoing off the walls. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously and began to check Michael's jacket. The tension in the room became suffocating. Then, with a metallic clink, a small object fell to the floor. It was a recording device. The prosecutor's face went pale. He stepped forward quickly, his voice shaky. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, trying to regain control of the moment. But Luke barked again, his alert stance unyielding. The truth was clear. Whatever was on that device mattered. Michael stared at the small recorder, his heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Could this be the proof he'd been waiting for? Did you feel the power of the bond between Michael and Luke? Imagine what's still to come in this gripping and emotional story. If you want to find out what's on that recorder and how it could change everything, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The next thrilling moment is just getting started. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. The small recording device lay in the center of the floor, its metallic casing glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Luke remained rigid beside Michael, his piercing barks cutting through the room as if demanding someone pay attention. Every set of eyes turned to the object, and the air became thick with tension. "Pick it up," the judge ordered, his voice low but firm. The officer closest to the device hesitated for a moment before bending down and scooping it into his hand. He held it up for all to see, confusion etched across his face. "What is this?" the judge asked sharply, directing his gaze toward the prosecutor, who was already beginning to sweat. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his face pale. "Your Honor, This is irrelevant. It's not part of the evidence submitted during the trial," he stammered. "Clearly it's been tampered with." The judge interrupted, his eyebrows knitting together. In a courtroom during sentencing, his voice carried a razor-sharp edge now, and the prosecutor visibly flinched. "Officer, activate the device." The officer fumbled with the small recorder, his fingers trembling as he pressed the play button. A static-filled crackle filled the room, followed by muffled voices. Everyone leaned forward, straining to listen, and then the words hit like a bombshell. "Just plant the evidence," a gruff voice said. "Clear as day. No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat." "Get it done." Gasps erupted across the room. Michael's heart stopped, then began pounding furiously. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone he had trusted, his former supervisor, Captain Ray Harding. "That's enough," the prosecutor blurted, rushing toward the officer holding the recorder. But the judge slammed his gavel down. "Sit down," he barked, his tone so commanding that the prosecutor froze mid-step. Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. The damning recording revealed everything: how the evidence had been planted, how he had been framed. Luke, still sitting calmly at Michael's side, let out a single low growl, as if echoing his partner's silent fury. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "This trial is not over," he said firmly, addressing the room. "BFFs, escort the defendant back to holding. Officers, secure that device as new evidence. We're reopening this case for the first time in weeks." Michael felt a spark of hope as he was led away. Luke watched him go, his intelligent eyes filled with unshakable loyalty. Michael turned back for one last look at his partner, silently promising himself and Luke that he wouldn't let this injustice stand. Back in the cold holding cell, Michael sat on the hard bench, staring at the blank concrete wall. His mind raced with everything that had just happened. Luke's sharp instincts had uncovered what no one else had: proof of a setup. That recording was his lifeline, but the revelation wasn't just a relief, it was a betrayal. Captain Ray Harding, the man who had mentored him for years, was behind it. Michael clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. How deep did this go? Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, tension ran high. The judge sat at his desk, replaying the recording on a secure device. The voices were unmistakable. Captain Harding's commanding tone, paired with another voice Michael didn't recognize, revealed a calculated conspiracy. The judge's eyes narrowed. He pressed a button on his intercom. "Summon Captain Harding to my office immediately," he said curtly. Outside the courtroom, Harding had been waiting to ensure Michael's sentencing went smoothly at least for his plan, but when the BFF approached him with the judge's sudden summons, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He rose stiffly, adjusting his tie, and followed the officer down the hall. Inside the chambers, the judge's expression was unreadable as Harding entered. The captain offered a polite nod, but his shoulders were tense. "You called for me, Your Honor?" Harding asked, his voice steady though his eyes flicked nervously toward the recording device on the desk. "I did," the judge replied, leaning forward. He tapped the recorder with his finger. Care to explain this? Harding's facade of confidence faltered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor," he said evenly. The judge pressed play once again. The damning words filled the room. Harding's face drained of color, but he recovered quickly. "Your Honor, this is absurd," Harding said, forcing a chuckle. "That could be anyone. You can't seriously think I don't think?" The judge interrupted, his voice hard. "I act on evidence, and this," he gestured to the recorder, "is evidence of a crime, multiple crimes, in fact." BFFs. Before Harding could respond, two BFFs entered the room. Panic flashed in his eyes as they approached him. "What are you doing?" Harding demanded, his voice rising. "You can't. You're being detained for questioning," the judge said firmly. "Until we get to the bottom of this, you're a suspect in the obstruction of justice and falsifying evidence." As the BFFs led a protesting Harding away, the judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The web of corruption was unraveling fast, and Michael Carter's story was far from over. The recording's discovery had thrown the entire department into turmoil as Captain Harding was taken into custody. Whispers of corruption spread like wildfire among the officers. Meanwhile, Michael sat in his holding cell, unaware of the storm brewing outside. His thoughts lingered on Luke. The loyal K9 had been the one to uncover the device, and now Michael couldn't help but wonder if Luke could find that. What else could he expose elsewhere? Luke was taken to the department's K9 unit for evaluation. Officer Sarah Mitchell, one of Michael's closest colleagues, had volunteered to look after the dog until the case was resolved. Luke seemed restless, pacing in his kennel and occasionally letting out sharp barks that echoed through the otherwise quiet building. "He knows something's wrong," Sarah muttered, watching him from outside the kennel. She crouched down, looking Luke in the eyes. "Don't worry, buddy, we'll figure this out." But as Sarah stood up, her gaze shifted to Luke's nose, which was pressed against the gate. Sniffing intently at her jacket, her stomach churned. Was this behavior connected to Michael's case, or was she imagining things? She hesitated for a moment before opening the kennel door. "All right, boy," she said, grabbing Luke's leash. "Let's see if you're trying to tell us something." She brought Luke to Michael's locker in the department storage room. The dog immediately began sniffing and pawing at the lower compartment. Sarah's heart raced as she unlocked it and opened the door. Inside, beneath a few folded uniforms, was a small unmarked envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy but damning. They showed a man, clearly Captain Harding, meeting with a known criminal. A document tucked behind the photos outlined transactions that implicated Harding in a bribery scheme tied to the very case that had led to Michael's arrest. Sarah stared at the evidence, her chest tightening. "Luke," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you just found the smoking gun." Realizing the magnitude of what she held, Sarah immediately contacted the judge's office. The photos and documents, combined with the recording Luke had uncovered, painted a clear picture of Harding's guilt. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. If Harding had orchestrated this setup, he likely hadn't done it alone. Luke sat beside her, his steady presence grounding her as her mind raced. "Michael was right," she said softly, scratching behind Luke's ears. "You really are the best partner anyone could ask for." Sarah sat in the evidence room, the incriminating photos spread out on the desk before her. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. Captain Harding wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was part of something much larger. The documents Luke had helped uncover outlined connections to other high-ranking officials, payments that couldn't be explained, and a disturbing trail of manipulation that reached far beyond Michael's case. She glanced down at Luke, who sat alert beside her. His piercing eyes seemed to sense her unease. "This isn't just about Michael," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "This goes way deeper." Realizing the severity of the situation, Sarah called the judge directly. Within an hour, the evidence she'd uncovered was in his hands. The judge's face darkened as he reviewed the documents and photos. "This is bigger than I thought," he admitted, his voice heavy. "If these documents are accurate, Michael Carter isn't just innocent, he's a victim of a department-wide cover-up." The judge immediately ordered an emergency hearing. News of the case reopening sent shockwave through the precinct. Officers whispered in hallways, tensions rising as suspicions grew. Several officers who had testified against Michael began to squirm, knowing their involvement might come under scrutiny. Back in his cell, Michael was called out unexpectedly. The sudden commotion in the jail's holding area made his pulse quicken. He was escorted to a secure room where Sarah was waiting with the judge. As soon as Michael saw the folder of evidence and Luke sitting proudly by Sarah's side, his heart swelled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "This just came in," the judge said, sliding the documents toward Michael. "It proves Harding's corruption, and most importantly, that the evidence used to convict you was fabricated." Michael's hands trembled as he flipped Through the papers, the photos, the records, and even notes detailing how Harding had manipulated the case against him, it was all there. His voice cracked as he asked, "Does this mean?" The judge nodded firmly. "It means you're going free, but this isn't over yet. There are more people involved and we're going to need your help to expose them." Michael knelt down, pulling Luke into another embrace. "You saved me, boy," he whispered. "You saved me again." As Luke wagged his tail, the relief in the room was palpable, but Michael knew this was just the beginning. Whoever had orchestrated this went deeper than Harding. There were more layers to uncover, and Michael wouldn't rest until the entire truth was brought to light. What do you think will happen next? Will Michael uncover the full truth behind this conspiracy? Share your thoughts in the comments. Michael stepped out of the courthouse for the first time as a free man, but the weight of what lay ahead was far heavier than the shackles he had just shed. Reporters swarmed the steps shouting questions about his release, the reopened case, and the corruption scandal brewing within the department. Michael ignored them, his focus solely on Luke, who trotted faithfully at his side. The sight of his loyal K-9 partner brought a flicker of hope amid the chaos inside the courthouse. The judge had convened a special task force to investigate the growing web of corruption. Sarah, now an integral part of the team, was leading the charge. The photos, recordings, and financial records Luke had helped uncover pointed to a sprawling network of bribery and evidence tampering involving multiple officers and even external players. Captain Harding was just the tip of the iceberg, Michael, Sarah said, catching up to him outside the courthouse. "We need your help. No one knows this department better than you." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. He had spent his entire career trusting the badge, believing in the integrity of the system. Now that trust was shattered, but as he looked down at Luke, the dog's calm, determined eyes reminded him of why he had joined the force in the first place. He finally said, "But I'm not doing this for the department. I'm doing it for the truth and for every officer who's still fighting for what's right." The investigation began in earnest. Sarah and Michael worked tirelessly, piecing together timelines, cross-referencing cases, and interviewing officers who had worked closely with Harding. Some were willing to cooperate, but others stonewalled their silence, raising more suspicions. Luke played a surprising role, sniffing out hidden files and leading them to overlooked evidence. During searches of Harding's office and locker one night, while sifting through a pile of old case files, Sarah discovered a list of names, officers, local politicians, and known criminals linked to suspicious payments and unsolved crimes. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the trail became. It was clear that this wasn't just about Michael's case, it was about an entire network of people who had used their power to cover up crimes and destroy anyone who stood in their way. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice heavy with concern, "if we push this any further, we're going to make enemies, dangerous ones." Michael looked up from the file he was studying. "We've already made them," he said, "but I'm not stopping, not until the whole truth comes out." Luke let out a soft bark as if in agreement. Michael reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears, his resolve hardening. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, betrayed, or framed. The task force was working around the clock. Boxes of evidence filled every available desk in the small conference room that had become the investigation headquarters. Michael, now officially cleared of all charges, had thrown himself into the work. The deeper they dug, the more twisted the web of corruption became. Bank statements, falsified police reports, and intercepted communications all pointed to a massive conspiracy that extended far beyond Captain Harding. Sarah placed a thick folder in front of Michael, her expression grim. "We've identified at least 6 other officers who were in on this," she said. "Some of them are high-ranking, and it gets worse. There's evidence tying them to organized crime." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. These weren't just rogue officers breaking the rules for personal gain. This was an orchestrated operation blending corruption within the department with criminal enterprises outside of it. "If this is as big as it looks, we can't handle this alone," he said. "We need to take this federal." But Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We're still missing key pieces. If we take this to the FBI now and they leak it, the whole operation could scatter. We need something definitive, something that locks these people in place." Their conversation was interrupted by Luke, who suddenly stood up from where he had been lying by Michael's feet. The dog's ears perked as he trotted toward the door, sniffing the air. Michael frowned. "What is it, boy?" he asked, following Luke. Luke led Michael to the far side of the conference room, where a stack of old case files sat in disarray. Sarah followed, watching as Luke began to pore at one particular box. Michael opened it, his heart pounding. Inside were files from a case closed 5 years ago, a drug bust that had supposedly resulted in a clean sweep of arrests. But as Michael flipped through the documents, he noticed glaring inconsistencies. Names had been erased and some sections of the reports were blacked out. "This doesn't make sense," Michael muttered. "These aren't standard redactions. Someone doctored these files." Sarah leaned over his shoulder. "And look at this," she said, pointing to a handwritten note at the bottom of one report. It was a signature. Captain Harding's. The drug bust had been the perfect cover, but the evidence in the box suggested that the operation had been a smoke screen to eliminate rivals in the drug trade while shielding certain criminals who were paying off the department. Michael clenched his fists. "They were playing both sides," he said, anger lacing his voice, "and they ruined good officers' lives to do it." As they continued sifting through the files, Michael's phone buzzed. It was a text from an anonymous number. "You're digging Too deep, stop or you'll regret it. He stared at the screen for a long moment before showing Sarah. She looked up at him, her face pale, but determined. They are scared, she said. That means we're getting close. Michael glanced at Luke, who sat calmly by his side as if ready for whatever came next. Let them come, he said. We're not stopping now. Michael stared at the text on his phone. You're digging too deep, stop or you'll regret it. The message sent a chill through him. It wasn't just a vague warning, it was a direct threat. He showed it to Sarah, who leaned over the desk, her expression grim. This isn't random, she said quietly. They know exactly what we're working on. They've been watching us. Her words hung heavy in the air, the weight of their situation settling in as the rest of the team left for the night. Michael and Sarah stayed behind, determined to uncover the missing piece of the puzzle. Luke lay by Michael's feet, his ear occasionally twitching as he rested. We're close, but we're still missing the key, Sarah said, sifting through the files. She pointed to a document Michael hadn't noticed before. Look at this. Every major bribe and erased report ties back to one name, AR. They the one pulling the strings. Michael's eyes narrowed as he stared at the initials AR. He muttered, they've stayed hidden this long, but if we find them, this whole operation crumbles. Suddenly Luke stood up, his body tense, his ears flicked forward, and he let out a low growl. Michael looked down at him, alarmed. What is it, boy? He asked, but before Sarah could answer, the lights in the conference room flickered and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. That's not a power outage, she said, her voice low and steady. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed by the unmistakable thud of footsteps outside the door. Michael's heart raced as adrenaline surged through his veins. He motioned for Sarah to take cover. We're not alone, he whispered. Luke crouched low, his growl deepening, his sharp eyes fixed on the doorway. Whoever had sent the text wasn't bluffing. They had come to stop the investigation. The footsteps grew louder, inching closer. Michael gripped his weapon tightly, his mind racing through the possibilities. Stay close, Luke, he whispered. Sarah locked eyes with him, her expression resolute. Whatever happens, she said, we don't let them win. As the door creaked open, Luke leapt forward, his instincts sharp and ready. Michael steadied his aim, prepared for whatever was about to come through that door. They were under attack, and the fight to expose the truth had just turned deadly. The door burst open, and chaos erupted in an instant. A shadowed figure stepped into the room, their weapon drawn. Before they could react, Luke lunged with incredible speed, clamping his jaws onto the intruder's arm. The man let out a guttural scream, dropping his weapon as he tried to shake the dog off. Michael didn't hesitate. He swept the gun away with his foot and trained his own weapon on the second figure now rushing through the doorway. Don't move, Michael shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The second intruder froze, their hands raised, but the tension in their stance told him they were waiting for an opportunity to strike. Behind him, Sarah had taken cover and was calling for backup on her radio, her voice steady but urgent. Luke held firm on the first man, growling low as the intruder struggled. Call him off, the man yelled. In panic, Michael stepped forward, his gun steady. Called them off first. He shot back, motioning toward the others outside. He could hear more footsteps echoing in the hall, heavy and deliberate. Whoever these people were, they hadn't come to negotiate. The man didn't respond, but before Michael could press further, another deafening sound filled the air. Tear gas canisters being thrown into the room. Thick acrid smoke began to fill the space, stinging their eyes and throats. We out of time, Sarah yelled, grabbing the files they'd been working on. We need to move, Michael whistled sharply, and Luke immediately released his grip on the man's arm, retreating back to Michael's side. The team moved quickly, ducking low to avoid the gas as they pushed toward the emergency exit at the back of the room. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets pinging off walls and furniture. Michael could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he covered Sarah and Luke, firing back to slow their pursuers. Bursting through the exit, they found themselves in the dark alley behind the building. Sarah clutched the files to her chest, gasping for air. We can't go back to the precinct, she said between breaths. They've compromised everything. They'll be waiting for us. Michael nodded, his mind racing. Whoever Ark was, they were playing for keeps. But as he looked down at Luke, who stood at his side panting but unshaken, Michael felt a surge of resolve. Then we finish this on our terms, he said. We're not running anymore. The safe house was eerily quiet. Michael, Sarah, and Luke had retreated thereafter, narrowly escaping the attack at the precinct. The small cabin hidden deep in the woods was their last refuge. Spread across the wooden table in front of them where the Phil Sarah had managed to save, they contained everything they needed to expose the network transaction records, names and ties to Ark, the shadowy figure who had orchestrated everything. Sarah flipped through the files, her fingers trembling slightly. This is it, she said. If we can get this to the press or federal investigators, they won't be able to cover it up. The entire operation will crumble. Michael nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window, scanning the tree line. He knew it wasn't over. Whoever had attacked them wouldn't stop until they were silenced. Suddenly Luke's ears perked and he let out a low growl, his body tensing. Michael froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. They found us, he whispered. Sarah looked up, her face pale but determined. How? We've been careful. Michael shook his head. It doesn't matter. They are here. The first shot shattered the stillness, breaking through the cabin's window. Glass sprayed across the room as Michael shoved Sarah behind the table for cover. Luke barked furiously, standing his ground at Michael's side. More shots out, the attackers closing in. Michael took a deep breath, adrenaline flooding his veins. Stay down, he told Sarah. Luke and I will hold them off. He and Luke moved in perfect sync as the attackers breached the front door. Michael fired, taking out one of the intruders. Luke lunged at another, his powerful jaws bringing the man to the ground, but the attackers kept coming. Sarah crawled toward the files, grabbing the most important documents and stuffing them into a bag. Michael, she shouted over the gunfire, we need to get these out of here now. Michael nodded, his face grim. Go, Luke, and I will cover you. Sarah hesitated for a split second before slipping out the back door, disappearing into the darkness with the evidence in hand. Michael and Luke held their ground, pushing back the attackers with every ounce of strength they had just as the last intruder fell. Sirens echoed in the distance. Backup had finally arrived. Days later, the story broke nationwide. Sarah had delivered the files to a trusted journalist, and the resulting expose brought the entire network crashing down. Arrests were made at every level, from corrupt officers to AR himself, revealed to be a powerful local politician who had been using the police department as his personal enforcers. Michael was hailed as a hero, though he brushed off the attention standing on the porch of his home he watched play in the yard. The loyal dog had saved him more times than he could count, and their bond had grown unbreakable. We did it, boy, Michael said softly, kneeling to scratch behind Luke's ears. It's over. Luke wagged his tail, leaning into Michael's touch, his sharp eyes calm for the first time in weeks. For Michael, it wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the start of something new. He'd fought for justice, not just for himself, but for the people who'd been silenced and betrayed. And as he watched Luke chase after a ball in the golden light of the setting sun, he knew they'd earned this moment of peace. What an incredible story, right? If it touched your heart, send a super sticker. Click the icon below the video, pick your favorite sticker, set the amount, and confirm your support. Helps us bring more emotional stories. Thank you for being with us.